So clinical trials are a way of advancing treatments. So I would always encourage people to at least consider clinical trials, just because we don't know which studies, which treatments are going to change the future, and so we need people to go into these if they're suitable for them. And you know, over the years I've seen many of the drugs that we now use as standard being trialled, and many that we haven't, but I have seen some great things happen for patients, and I've looked after a lot of patients who've had some kind of help from these studies. So you never quite know what's going to be for you, but sometimes I think it's worth giving it a go. So I am a research nurse for the Sarcoma Unit. I look after patients going into research studies, so I would initially meet them when they come and meet the consultant or the hospital team. I would come in and see them with a patient information leaflet, which that explains the study, talks about the logistics of the study, how many visits, what kind of drug we'll be using, and I talk them through sort of whether it's an academic study, if it's sponsored by a pharmaceutical study, and just talk to them about how we run the study, how long we've been running it for, and how many people we're looking for. Normally what I do is I leave the information sheet with the patient, and then we ask them to give us a call if they're interested. With this, normally patients ring back and let us know, and then we look at organising appointments to organise scans, blood tests, and whatever's required, because all studies generally have a screening period, and in the screening period we would meet the patient again and with the doctors, look at their medical history, run through all the information about the study, get them to sign a consent form, and then run through all the tests that will be required. After that, we're always the contact for patients when they're on the study, and we look at trying to organise things for them, to informing them when their appointments are, seeing them when they're in clinics, and also talking to them on the phone if there's any problems they're having at home. If there's anything we can organise, then we help them with that. So the Sarcoma Research Unit consists of many different people. On the clinical side, we have our consultants. We often have a research fellow that comes from various different places. We often have international doctors who come and work with us, looking specifically at looking after patients on clinical trials. We are a team of research nurses who will look after the clinical processes when they're in clinics. Then in order to set up studies, we have clinical trial coordinators who are in charge of looking and putting things through and getting ethics approvals and MHRA approvals for studies to be started. Then when people are on study, often we'll have lots of blood tests and things like that, and we're very lucky to have a tissue coordinator who will take those bloods, spin the bloods, send them off to the companies. Then with all the data that we gain from the studies, we have a data manager who inputs all that into the system so that the companies can get the data from the studies. So as a research nurse, we work very much in line with as your key worker. So in the same way that if you were off study, you'd have a clinical nurse specialist in order to provide support, ask questions and that sort of thing. We in turn would do the same thing for patients who are on study. So it's a case of, being an ear to be listening if you've got any problems. In some ways, we want to know those as much, if not more, because, sometimes you might think that something may be completely unrelated, but we have greater knowledge of the drug to think that maybe sometimes it might be related. So sometimes there might be things that you are worried about or you're concerned about, but you think you don't want to bother us, or you don't think it's anything to do with us, so it wouldn't be appropriate to speak to us. But actually, the thing about being on a research study is all these drugs are often, affect us in very different ways, including psychologically. And so it's really good to, if you have any problems, to discuss them with the research team. And I know that we are very lucky. We've got some lovely patients who we talk to all the time. And, sometimes the little things, once a worry is shared, then they can seem easier to cope with. So some of the barriers in going into studies can be related to the logistics of the study. Sometimes so all studies are often offered with a choice of going into a study or your standard line treatment. Standard line treatment might be one visit every 3 weeks, whereas a study may involve weekly visits. Sometimes this can be a barrier because people, for reasons such as people may have people at home that they care for, either elderly patients who have a loved one who they care for who may not be able to be left on their own, and therefore they would need to get someone to help them with caring for their loved one. Also, you can get people who are in young families who have children to care for, and trying to get childcare for frequent visits is really difficult. Other times, because most studies are run in sarcoma centres, often they're not your closest hospitals, so you're looking at the expense sometimes that can be run up when having to get into centres. So although some studies will provide expenses reimbursed, those generally tend to be the pharmaceutical studies, and we have a lot of academic studies as well which may not provide this reimbursement, and so I guess it's a case of whether this is an appropriate thing. Other questions we often get asked about studies are looking at the studies that can be a standard line treatment plus a standard line treatment using a drug or placebo, and sometimes it's about how you would feel if you got the placebo. You may not never know that you're on placebo, but would you still be happy entering into that study knowing that you have received the placebo for that study?